Well, hello, everyone. My name is Professor Christopher Cherwonka. I am an attorney and a law professor, and this is another one of what I'm calling career conversations. At the time I'm recording this, the United States is in the midst of a pandemic of coronavirus, which has closed most, if not all, of the nation's public schools. And these videos are intended to provide instructional type content and career education and inspiration by bringing some luminaries and intelligent folks and people who have accomplished a lot in their lives to talk about their career trajectories and advice that they may have for young people. It's a particular pleasure for me today to record this video because I have a friend of mine here with me that I've known for the better part of the last 15, 16 years. Dr. Christopher Breiseth is a historian, former college president, and nonprofit leader. And I will let him say a few words of introduction about himself before we get our conversation going.
Thank you, Chris. There are two Chris's for this interview. I am now retired in Ticonderoga, New York, on Lake George. I live on Lake George in a house that was originally built in 1820. So I have, as a historian, I have a connection with the past that's quite literal in my daily life. I was born in 1936, so I'm approaching my 84th birthday, which is relevant for this discussion because it means I was born in the middle of the Great Depression, and I came into my awareness during World War II. I remember Pearl Harbor, Sunday afternoon, sitting on the floor in our living room in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with several of my relatives gathered together as we listened to the radio and heard the news. I was 5 years old. I then remember in great detail the routines of the war as we went through them. And my father he was a businessman, was very active in Republican politics. And he'd actually been brought into politics by a guy named Harold Stassen, who was the youngest governor in Minnesota's history. But he'd sort of soured on him. And in 1940, when Roosevelt ran for a third term, my father supported Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican candidate, and spent some considerable time with him during the campaign. And in 1944, he assumed Willkie would be the nominee again and agreed to become a Republican elector for Willkie, but Willkie died before the convention, and Tom Dewey was the candidate. And my father did not like Tom Dewey, so he publicly, as did many Republicans, came out publicly for Roosevelt, which I experienced since I was, and this is what happened during the wartime, kids actually played some fairly adult roles. Across the street, one of my buddies who was older than I had a paper route, and like Tom Sawyer with the painting of the fence, I delivered the morning paper, and I also would collect subscriptions. And the word came out that my father was supporting Roosevelt as an elector for Dewey, and people called him a traitor to my face as I collected their money. And I stubbornly maintained my Republican identity, and I supported Dewey. I didn't like his vice presidential nominee, John Bricker, the senator from Ohio. I liked Harry Truman. So my ticket as an 8-year-old, I believe 7-year-old, was for Truman and Dewey, which of course was historically made no sense, but was kind of amusing. I changed that allegiance the day Roosevelt died. And I saw my parents crying. Our neighbor next door who worked for the Office of War Information they all three cried in the kitchen. And I remember just how stirring this was for the country. And I, from that moment, became a Democrat and a loyal supporter of Roosevelt. And if I can step away from the camera, I will bring you something that happened to me at that time.
Sure, absolutely.
The first thing I ever bought through the mail as an 8-year-old was this picture of Roosevelt,
Oh,
which is the unfinished portrait that was being painted of him when he died. And that was the first thing I bought for 50 cents. I've had this with me and on my wall ever since. So Roosevelt became a huge figure in my life. And I began a collection of everything about him and about presidents in general, all through my high school days. So I had mountains of material, which I ultimately turned over to my brother, who continued the collection. Fast forward, after going through college at UCLA, we moved to California from Minnesota in 1949. I went to Cornell to do my PhD in history. And while I was there, I lived in a place called the Telluride House, which is a scholarship house, and we had faculty guests living with us. And one of the people that I personally, as head of the resident guest committee, I invited was Frances Perkins. And Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet member, and she was FDR's Secretary of Labor for 12 years and primarily responsible for the domestic agenda of the New Deal, including Social Security, unemployment insurance, workman's comp, 40-hour work week, and so on. She had worked for Roosevelt as governor of New York, and she'd worked for the entire governorship of Al Smith, who preceded Roosevelt as governor of New York. So she was the continuity for the progressive tradition that started with Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 on through to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. By having invited her to live with us, I also asked her if she would invite Henry Wallace, who was the vice president during the third term of Roosevelt, they were each other's best friends in the cabinet, if he would come to Cornell, and we had a seminar. So I conducted, at the age of 24, a seminar between the Secretary of Labor and the Vice President of the United States. And the next year, my first year of teaching at Williams College, I came back and we had a seminar with James Farley, who was the top political operative for Governor Roosevelt as he ran for the presidency, and then became the Postmaster General through the first 2 terms. So I had this unusual experience of actually interacting with people who were part of Roosevelt's cabinet. And this ultimately led to my becoming, in retirement after a period of 20 years as a college president, to becoming head of the board of the Frances Perkins Center in Newcastle, Maine, which was her home. So I have been working on the legacy of Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins at a time when more and more people are looking back to the New Deal as an example of positive government helping people at a time of great trouble.
You know, I think that answer will illustrate to our viewing audience just why I asked you to be a part of this series, which is that, as you've already discovered out there, Dr. Breiseth is really, really fantastic at storytelling and weaving together really compelling history, because I've known you for, like I said, 15, 16 years, and There were things in there that I didn't know, and that I, needless to say, find fascinating. I want to rewind the tape a little bit and go back to your early life growing up in the Depression, and then of course the outbreak of World War II and the home front. Can you describe a little bit what the experience of the home front was like, what it was like growing up at that period of American history?
My memory of the Depression is really very minimal. What I do remember is that my family, which was very fortunate, because my father who was a graduate of the University of Minnesota, as was my mother, had a good job when they got married in 1931. So he was able to provide for us. In fact, they built one of the only 5 houses in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the year 1933. But what I remember is that friends of theirs who were out of work would come and take meals with us. So while it was a very middle-class experience, I was aware of adults who were having trouble making ends meet. The war is vivid in my memory because we children were, as I indicated earlier with my paper route, we were directly involved in the war effort. I was a stamp monitor selling 25-cent stamps once a week, which people bought and put into what became $18.75 bonds, savings bonds. And when they matured, they became $25 bonds. And this is part of how we helped fund the war. And after our school had bought enough bonds to be the equivalent of what a Jeep cost, the Army brought a Jeep to our school. I remember driving up the steps, which was something our family car could never do. And my older sister wrote the following: Fuller School has bought a Jeep. It will make the Fuhrer weep. So we hated Hitler. We hated Tojo, who was the leader of the Japanese. And it was all very personal. There's a lot of racism involved, which is part of the war. We collected newspapers twice a year, newspaper drives. We would stack up newspaper along the wall at our school. I don't know how many tons we would collect every time. We'd go from door to door with our wagons. And we collected scrap steel. We collected fat and took it to the butcher. So we did a victory garden on our was a vacant lot at the corner of our block, and we all together planted all the major vegetables, which serviced the whole neighborhood with fresh lettuce and carrots and tomatoes, cucumbers, peas, beans, and when there was someone killed in the neighborhood in service, the gold star would be in the window, indicating this was a mother who had lost a son or a husband or a grandchild. And so we lived with the notion of loss. I remember D-Day, June 6, 1944. I got up at breakfast, and given the time difference from Normandy to Minneapolis, the headline in the paper was D-Day. And this was the great invasion by the American, Canadian, the British across the English Channel to the French coast, and began the pushing back of the German troops. So we were aware that the globe in our schoolroom was something that we used to follow the battles. Where were we? When kids, fathers came home on leave or furlough, often in uniform, they would come to talk to us. So we had a very direct sense of being connected. And one of the consequences of this, Chris, I think, which is a generational point, is that those of us who raised in that environment have a deep commitment to our institutions and to the Constitution, because we were old enough to be taught that these institutions of ours one had to fight for and even die for. So while I'm a liberal politically, I'm very conservative about our institutions. And when they seem under attack by people who don't seem to understand the Constitution or seem committed to it, I feel personally attacked and offended. My two brothers who were born after the war have very different perspectives than the three of us who were born before the war. Same parents, but we're two really different families. So I think the generation that you're part of and what you're going through, this generation is going to be marked by the pandemic. And what we experience going through this will affect this younger generation for the rest of their lives. It'll be a frame of reference in terms of time, but also the things that happen to us in this next couple of years will change things profoundly, and they will shape your sense of what's important, what's possible, what's exciting, what's terrifying, just as the war was that for me and my generation.
I think if I had to choose a singular event that had the being life-shaping within my lifetime as I was growing up, it would, of course, have to have been 9/11. Because I remember exactly where I was, when I found out what had happened. And I remember that life, I remember what life was like before the attacks of 9/11, and I obviously know what life was and is like now after. And it strikes me in listening to your response that society as a whole goes through what I will loosely term historical epics, which define generational experiences. I wonder if that was one of the reasons why you decided to pursue history as a career path, or whether there were other things behind that decision.
Let me first, because you mentioned 9/11, 9/11 occurred at the end of the first week of my life in Hyde Park on the job as the president of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. And after the first plane went into the tower, I was having a staff meeting, and I raced upstairs to the director's office in the FDR library and got there in time to see the second plane hit the tower. And I said out loud, "Everything changes." And I felt that again with this pandemic. We're never going to go back to the way things were before the pandemic. It's going to be different. There's going to be some things better, some things worse, but it's going to be different, as it was after 9/11. It transformed the way we did things, the way we looked at things, the way we treated each other. But going back to being history, as a kid, I wanted to be president of the United States, so I had to make adjustments along the way. And through much of my high school and college, I was going to be a Unitarian minister. And I then had a wonderful experience as a junior in college of going with a team of students from UCLA to India. So I had a summer meeting with Indian students all over the subcontinent of India. And when I got back from there, I thought there were other things in the world to be done that I would like to prepare for. So I was given the challenge of getting something called a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, which was given to, at this period, again, my generational experience is important. For my generation, born in the 1930s, they were hungry for us to become teachers at the college level, because our college teachers were old, not old as I am now, but they were in their 50s and 60s, and there was not a refreshing group coming up. So they were recruiting us. And the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship was designed to get for teachers of the college level to look at who their students were that would be good college professors, and then offer them a graduate fellowship or be in competition for a graduate fellowship. So that's what got me to Cornell. I thought I would do a master's degree, and the man I went to work with in intellectual history, which was the field I was pursuing, said our first meeting, so well, you don't want to do a master's degree, you want to do a PhD. So all of a sudden I was launched on a PhD program without any intention of doing that. And I pursued that, and one thing led to another, and I had the chance, because of the same Telluride house where Miss Perkins came to live with us, to go to Oxford. So I ended up doing a master's degree at Oxford in British history, and came back, finished at Cornell, and then I began teaching European history at Williams College. So I kind of slipped into the field as a professional, but my interest, as my story about Franklin Roosevelt's death, I hope it conveys, I always was fascinated by history. And my great hero as a boy was Abraham Lincoln. And I ended up, after my first teaching job at Williams, after a period of a year at the University of Chicago, I ended up teaching in Springfield, Illinois, at a brand new university called Sangamon State University. Well, Springfield, Illinois is where Abraham Lincoln had his entire adult life, except for his 4+ years as president. And I got very involved in the life of Abraham Lincoln in his town, and I became very involved in the issue of race. My first major paper at the University of Chicago was on Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, the great Black abolitionist. So there were two moments, Chris, that are the most magic moments in my life as a historian. One was giving my paper on Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in the well of the old state capitol in Springfield, where Lincoln gave his House Divided speech in 1858, which launched his career, and which is, by the way, the building where Barack Obama announced his presidency and came back to announce his decision to make Joe Biden his vice president candidate. The other speech was when I was working at the Roosevelt Institute in Hyde Park. I went every April 12th, which was the death date of Franklin Roosevelt. I went to Warm Springs where he died. And one of those years, I gave a speech on Franklin Roosevelt in Warm Springs, standing on the steps of the little White House where he died. And those two speeches, linking me directly to Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, kind of filled my well as a student of history.
Wow, I can't imagine two more profoundly moving experiences for a student of history, and I mean that in the broadest sense, not necessarily a college student, but a lifelong student of history, to have. I think that that makes for a great segue actually into your time spent at Hyde Park, which is how the two of us entered into each other's circles, to my great fortune and pleasure. Can you give us a sense of how you ended up in that position and what motivated you to take it?
Well, there's a big word called serendipity. Just the things that happen that you don't plan, that have a great impact on your life. And much of my life, and I say this to young people, you have to put a lot into your life to make it really produce a lot. But you've got to be open to things happening that you don't expect, and then follow them. Just as I ended up with a PhD from Cornell, because I was pushed by professors my senior year in college. Actually, it was the end of my junior year of college to consider doing graduate work. That got me to Cornell, and that gave me this opportunity for Telluride House, which gave me my opportunity both to go to Oxford, as well as to meet Miss Perkins, as well as to meet my wife of almost 50 years. Well, I become, in the course of being a teacher, I ended up going out to Illinois, get involved with Lincoln. And one of the projects I became involved with, this brand new state university, and this of course is the state capital of Illinois, made that by Abraham Lincoln as a young legislator who wanted his hometown to be the state capital. In that setting, we decided, as the new history department of this new university, to bring a up-to-date interpretation of Abraham Lincoln to the 5 major historic sites in Springfield, which included his, New Salem, which was out in the country, which was the town he was in before he came to Springfield, his law office, his home, the old state capitol where I subsequently gave my talk, and his tomb where he's buried. And when we first got to Springfield with this brand new university, the town treated them as shrines. So on the Interstate 55, the big green interstate sign said, off this exit for the Lincoln Shrines. And we thought, we need to bring Lincoln down to earth. He was a real person. So we began in many different ways, our courses and our work in the community, repossessing Abraham Lincoln as a fellow townsman and as a president. And in the course of that, we got a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, very sizable one, to reinterpret the 5 sites. And among other things, to produce a set of booklets, one on each site. And the person that we hired with the grant was a guy named Jeffrey Ward. And Jeffrey Ward has done the major scenarios for Ken Burns's series on PBS, including the Civil War. We got Jeff, along with other historians, to come out and walk the sites to get ideas for how do we interpret New Salem? How do we interpret the old state capitol? And those pamphlets were absolutely wonderful. And when I became president of Wilkes University in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, one of the great privileges I had was to recommend it to our board people that should get an honorary doctorate. So I recommended that Jeff Ward be given an honorary doctorate as someone who'd return narrative to American history. Well, Jeff did not have a doctorate. He's written several major historical books, 3 on Roosevelt. And he was quite pleased, which was evidenced by the fact that once I was at Hyde Park, he invited me and my wife to come to a book signing for his book. His book came from the jazz series on PBS that Ken Burns had done with Quentin Marsalis and others. And when I was at that book signing, which happened to be the day after the 2000 election, and I was talking to Arthur Schlesinger about whether his theories of cycles in history pertain to that 2000 election, which was not yet decided between Bush and Gore. Jeff Ward said, "Do you know Ambassador William Vandernovel?" I said, "I've known Ambassador Vandernovel for 37 years because he had been a student at the college, which I subsequently became president of, called Deep Springs College, which was a college for 24 students on a cattle ranch in the high Sierras. And Bill had been a student there in the 1940s, long before I was a student. And I never was a student there, but I became president there. And so he was one of the alumni that I cultivated to support the college. So Jeff took me over to see Bill. And you, Chris, know that Ambassador Van Heuvel has been profoundly important
Oh, yes.
to the Roosevelt tradition. There'd not be a Henry Wallace Center there without Bill's active support of that. There'd not be the FDR Memorial in Washington without his literally getting money from Ronald Reagan. And there wouldn't be the Four Freedoms Memorial on Roosevelt Island in New York. So Bill Van Heuvel is about to have his 90th birthday this coming week. As I frequently introduced him, there's probably no non-scholar in American history who's done more for the reputation of a president than Ambassador Van Heuvel has done for Franklin Roosevelt. Well, I went over and we began talking. And within 20 minutes, he offered me the job to come to Hyde Park to be president of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. At that point, I was the president of Wilkes University in Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania. I'd been there for 17 years. I'd announced my retirement. So I was going to be leaving Wilkes. And he said, why don't you come to Hyde Park? And that was in November of 2000. And by January, there was a meeting at his home in New York City where the executive committee came together and met me and voted on my becoming the president and CEO, for the first one, by the way, of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Institute. And so I came and started on September 4th, 2011, and I served until January 1st, 2009, with an interrupt of 18 months or 13 months in the middle of that when another person succeeded me, and then they asked me to come back and complete my term. So I had really virtually 8 years in Hyde Park, living in the Red House, which was a house bought by Roosevelt's father at the same time he bought Springwood, which was the great Roosevelt home where Roosevelt was born and where he is buried in the Rose Garden. So I had come from being directly involved with Lincoln, and it was because of my involvement with Lincoln that I got to know Jeff Ward, and it was coming to honor Jeff Ward for his work with Ken Burns that brought me in touch with Bill Van Heuvel, and the rest is history.
That's fascinating to me. I want to pick up on something you said, which is you used the term serendipity. And I was thinking back to the start of our friendship and our relationship. And I was thinking you couldn't have chosen a better word to describe, from my perspective, how our friendship started. I don't expect you to, because it was so long ago and you did so much there, but by any chance, do you remember the circumstances under which we first met? Because I do.
You should tell it. I remember us being at an event.
So it was at an event with Geraldine Ferraro and Mary Catherine Bateson, the cultural anthropologist. And Miss Ferraro at the time was active doing something called her Granny Voter Project, trying to drive older Americans to vote. And during the question and answer period, I had asked her about, the problem in the other direction, youth involvement. And it was after the event, and I was sort of mingling with everyone there. And you came up to me and introduced yourself, and we got to talking. And that was the start of what would be a multi-year relationship where I sort of became a informal outreach ambassador for the library and the work that the Institute was doing, and through your kindness, and here's the part where I publicly say thank you, where I've said it to you privately probably dozens of times over the years. For me, as at the time I was in 8th or 9th grade. I'm this kid, and particularly as a kid with a physical disability whose opportunities had thereby been somewhat limited to that point. The opportunity to be a part of something like FERI under your very capable leadership, and with friends like David Woolner, who I know you and I are both very close to, was, and you could tell I'm emotional on the subject, was transformative to me in my life, because it wasn't just that I had the opportunity to meet and be mentored by people like Arthur Schlesinger, people like Jeff Ward, members of the Roosevelt family. I had an opportunity to meet and get to know. And it's interesting to me because I think particularly back to my relationship with Professor Schlesinger, and we only had a few interactions, but they were of sufficient length that I considered that a mentoring relationship. And he never, to his credit, even though I know he probably had 10 million other things to do whenever he was there, he never got tired of my questions. He never got tired of talking to me. And when my mother finally met him, he made her feel like $1 million, because she's the kind of person who gets a little nervous around people she perceives as of stature, particularly if they are publicly significant. And he just put her right at ease. And I owe a lot of my teaching approach and my outlook on the world to your kindness and your mentorship and that of the staff you had working with you. So this is the part of the interview where I say thank you for all of that.
Well, and I can say in return, I could always count on you to ask the first question in virtually every public forum, and one always needs someone to break the ice.
Well, I hope they were always good ones.
They were good questions, and coming from someone as young as you, they were often had a great impact on these famous people that came through. So you cut quite a figure as a young, passionate historian, and you were so well read and often would cite your sources for the question that you were asking, that the Schlesingers of the world took you very seriously. And I, as someone who'd done a lot of teaching over the course of many, many years, I have always, one of the most beautiful things is to see young people and older people interacting in a teaching learning relationship. And what I learned early, it's going both ways, because the older people are learning from the younger people. And if there's anything when I just meet a group of students for one time, one of the things I encourage them, I said, put yourself out there, ask questions, figure out what is it I should be asking this person that they can share with me. Because once you do that, you become part of their consciousness and they start taking you seriously. And Professor Trawanka did that repeatedly, so that for a cast of many very interesting characters of that period of our history, he was a known personality and was taken seriously, which in turn as you can just have heard him, nurtured him further and gave him more confidence in his own mind and intellect and the value of the questions he was asking. So I remember, in fact, I can't remember a public meeting you came to that you did not ask a question. And it was not just one, it was sometimes more than one. And I think that's a great model for students who are listening to this to know about, even if it's on Zoom and you're in a situation where you're interactive with a person, figure out the question that you should ask, even if it's just like getting your oar in the water. Um, because once you do that, you will start feeling a two-way connection with a person that will nurture you and will stimulate you to think more seriously, more clearly, and do more careful reading so that you know the things that you really should take an interest in. So I think Chris's description of how we met and how he used the Roosevelt Library and the new Henry Wallace Center as a classroom for himself is a good example for the rest of you. Not only to, if you're in that area, to do the same with the programs that are going on all the time at the FDR Library, but to go to public lectures in your area, wherever you're living. Look at the paper when they're. It doesn't just have to be history. It could be a poet who's coming to do a reading, or an economist who's coming to talk about the problems of the pandemic. Go and listen, and then figure out from what you're hearing, can I stand up and ask a question? And I'll tell you, as someone who's 83 years old, one of the most encouraging things for those of us who are nearing the end of our lives is to see that there's a younger generation that cares. And for a young person in an audience of mainly adults to raise a hand and ask a question gives a whole number of people in that room a thrill, saying there is a future. The future will be in good hands. I just saw it in that person who asked that question.
Well, thank you so much for that. That means a lot to me to hear you say that in that way. I think this is actually probably a pretty good segue for two questions. Number one is, I mentioned that one of my frames of reference in my sort of historical interaction with FDR and my direct interaction with members of his family was through the personal frame of reference of disability. Could you talk a little bit about, because I know back in those days, FDR kind of kept it quiet of necessity. There was the gentleman's understanding with the press that photos of the president in the wheelchair were not to be published. Would you mind speaking just a little bit about FDR's experience of disability and how you think it perhaps impacts our perception of people with disabilities today?
The speech that I gave at Warm Springs in Georgia on the occasion of the anniversary of his death, which I think if you Google me, and my last name is Breiseth, Christopher Breiseth, if you Google me, or you go to the francisperkinscenter.org, www.francisperkinscenter, all one word, you'll find my Warm Springs speech, which basically is an answer to Professor Twanka's question of me. Because what I did was to study his time at Warm Springs. And by the way, along with the picture, the unfinished portrait, one of the very first books I bought was called The Warm Springs Story. And it was a story written by a man who himself was a polio victim and had braces on his legs, as Roosevelt did. And I remember reading that book when I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and I was absolutely enamored of it. So you can realize why, when I got a chance to give this speech in Warm Springs, I was so almost overwhelmed. Well, it became clear to me as I studied Roosevelt's interest in Warm Springs and turning it into the rehabilitation center that he did for polio victims like himself, that it reestablished his confidence in himself to run something. Because the man who was running it when Roosevelt discovered the Warm Springs, the warm waters that were so therapeutic, died of cancer soon after Roosevelt got involved. and he had to take it over. And so he used his skills, which involved getting other people involved, like his law partner, Basil O'Connor, and his half-brother, Rosie Roosevelt, James Roosevelt, whose house my wife and I lived in, called the Red House, died in 1927 and left major money to his half-brother. And Roosevelt put most of that money into Warm Springs, much to the displeasure, by the way, of Mrs. Roosevelt, who felt they had 5 children that needed to be educated, and that money should have been used for that. But Roosevelt, the only record we have of this, when she was complaining about this, he abruptly said, "I never want you to talk about this again." So his commitment to Warm Springs was profound. And my central theme in the lecture was that he so invested himself in this place, which involved becoming involved with rehabilitation medicine. And he brought people there who were among the pioneers of rehabilitation work with people whose limbs did not work or other problems with their bodies. He really became known as Dr. Roosevelt. And he acquired a kind of confidence, again, that he could run something. He, by the way, had bought up to 2,000 acres of land, which he was trying to turn into different crops, as well as planting trees, which he did every place he was. As president, the CCC boys planted 3 billion trees, which helped stop the dust storms, the Dust Bowl. But he got confidence in himself as a manager. And so Warm Springs, which continues to be a place of rehabilitation medicine, now, by the way, for brain injury people from our time in Vietnam and Iraq, as the March of Dimes, which was funded, the research went into the polio vaccine, is now focusing on neonatal problems, children that are born prematurely. That's their focus now, so this focus has shifted. But what I discovered as I read about Roosevelt in Warm Springs was he probably was the first person that mobilized public support around a disease in order to stimulate research into mediating that disease for those who had it, but also finding ways to prevent it. And that, of course, has become something we do now for every disease. And typically the people that raise the money are families whose own children or spouses or siblings have that disease, and they become a center of fundraising activity. And you can see that countless cases where that's happening. Bill Gates right now and the Gates Foundation are putting in vast sums of money to develop a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus. Well, one of the stories, because I went every year on the 12th of April to Warm Springs, which is, by the way, the time when the azaleas and the rhododendron are blooming. It's the time of the Masters golf tournament, which is right near Warm Springs. So every time I went down there, it was in the midst of the Masters tournament. I was invited to sit with the advisory board of the group that had helped develop the little White House as a state historic site and with a wonderful museum about Roosevelt. And one of the men who was there was a judge, and he was a judge in a wheelchair. And because I went every year, I got to know him. And the last year I went, which was last year before he died, he told me the following story. You mentioned, Chris, that President Roosevelt tended to mask his paralysis, which he did as a means of being taken seriously as a political figure. But he was not this way around the people that knew him. He did tend to be wheeled into a meeting, and then the other people would come into the meeting, and he would wait until everybody left, at which point he'd be wheeled out to his office. He literally could not do anything by himself. He couldn't go to the bathroom on his own. He needed help in virtually every part of his life. And one of the points that I made is that he learned, as a very privileged young man, after the age of 39, when he was afflicted with polio, that you really can't do anything important on your own. You need the help of others. And I think part of why he was so providential to carry us through the Depression is that a lot of people who had done very well up to 1929, 1930, lost everything. And they had to build themselves back up, as he had to do. I mean, he literally, after 1929, after 1921, he could do nothing for himself. And in many areas of life, that was true till the day he died in 1945. But he learned to work with what he had and literally lifted the country up and then lifted the world up in his leadership through World War II. Well, I'm meeting with this judge, and he remembers as a 9-year-old boy, President Roosevelt coming down. He always came down for Thanksgiving, and he carved the turkey. And it was really his family, all these people who were there working to get on top of their polio paralysis. And he said, I remember that we were all at dinner, and he went over near the wall, and with the help of someone, he put on his braces, which together weighed 10 pounds. And he then stood up with his back to the wall on his own to show everybody there that he could stand again, and he was determined to walk again. And this young boy learned to walk again, and in his old age, his polio problems came back, confining him again to a wheelchair. But for virtually his whole adult life, he was able to walk and became a very distinguished judge in the Georgia court system. But his memory as a 9-year-old boy of the president, proudly standing on his own, was one that gave him courage.
I can't tell you how moving that is to me on a personal level. I want to go back to something you said in answering my question, which is that nobody really does anything important on their own or alone. FDR had a lot of help, if you will, both in his personal life with the disability, but also in his political and governing life. And two of his most important sources of strength were, of course, his wife, Eleanor, and Frances Perkins, whom we've mentioned earlier. And I'd like to, if I could, spend some time exploring both of them and their importance both to him and their importance individually, even outside of their association with him. I think the place I'd like to start with Eleanor Roosevelt is to just ask what your view of her importance in general to him was, because my understanding historically is that she was his rock and constantly supported him in everything that he did, and encouraged him not to give up in the face of his circumstances when he might have otherwise been inclined to do so. And I wonder if, before we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is Ms. Roosevelt's perhaps best known individual contribution among many, I wonder if you would speak to that as well.
Let me first comment on Roosevelt's relationship with women. I think he's almost the first of our presidents, and maybe the only one until we get to Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, who really had major women as advisors. Now, virtually all the modern presidents from Roosevelt on, there were significant women in their administration. And there were other cabinet secretaries after Francis Perkins. But I think because of Roosevelt's relationship with his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who was a difficult mother-in-law for Mrs. Roosevelt, for Eleanor, she was an incredible mother for Franklin. And she invested herself in him. And he took her seriously. He learned how to get out from under her shadow. There's a wonderful letter he wrote as an 8-year-old boy to his father. She said, "Papa, Mother went to town today and I took a bath by myself for the first time." So there was a rather hovering presence of his mother. But she was a brilliant woman. She managed the estate. All the property was in her name, except, by the way, for the Red House, which is the only thing that was in FDR's name. And so I think he was predisposed to see that women had great capacity. When Eleanor, who we'd known from the time she was an infant, because they were cousins, distant, but they did meet together, he was drawn to her intelligence, her poise, her smarts. And while the romance of it is very important, and the fact that she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece was not unimportant to a guy that was very ambitious politically. And Theodore Roosevelt gave his niece away at their wedding on St. Patrick's Day. He respected Eleanor Roosevelt. And they had a difficult time with their marriage early on, before the polio. But she stuck by him, and other women might not have. And she and Louis Howe, who was one of his major advisors, got him through the polio. I mean, their total dedication to him from the time at Campobello when he was afflicted with the polio through to getting him back into the swing of things politically in New York State, saved him as a politician. So her commitment was, as you suggest, you say she was a rock, but she often referred to herself as the eyes and ears, because she had the legs. And she got around not only the country, she got around the world. And she reported back to him. She wrote memos to him. He had an Eleanor inbox. Sometimes he found suffocating because she took an interest in virtually every problem. And she wanted to be taken seriously. And she often was. And she often had influence on him. Sometimes she didn't. And that was very punishing to her. But she understood that he was the president of the United States. She was not. But he used her sensitivity, he used her access to people, to different groups of people. She, for example, was extremely close to African Americans. And as we've come to focus more on African American history, and if you look at the relationship of the New Deal to the African American community, Eleanor is the crucial figure, more than Franklin. But she got Franklin to do things that were very important in retrospect in starting the civil rights movement, which then comes into its own in the 1950s and 60s. The court, by the way, that approves Brown v. Ford, that desegregates the school system, was a still majority court appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. So he had his impact even long after his death. Eleanor was, who had, in contrast to her husband, had a really miserable upbringing. She lost her mother when she was very young, and they had a not totally successful relationship. And then she lost her alcoholic father by the time she was 10, and she adored him. And he had been separated from her by her uncle Theodore, who was protecting his own political future by not having his very alcoholic brother in the picture. So Elliott Roosevelt was prevented from seeing his wife before she died and his 3 children. So she grew up as an orphan and with a grandmother who was a very stiff, unbending woman. And had she not had the experience in England at a wonderful school for young women, she may never have come into her own. But she got the opportunity in England. And she came back, and that's when young Franklin met her and was just enamored of what she had accomplished. So they, and the book, if people want to pursue this, I think is the book I recommend above all of the books when you want to deal with the two of them, is Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, No Ordinary Time. They become partners. It's no longer a traditional marriage. They sleep in separate bedrooms. Of course, after his polio, he's really almost in an invalid's bed situation where people have to come in the middle of the night to help him go to the bathroom. And so she has a bedroom next to him, but she's there as a partner. And they take on the world as a partnership. She writes her columns, her My Day columns, which comment on what's going on in the government, as well as what's going on in her life. So they are, unlike any other first couple we've had, a working partnership. So all the things that he accomplished were, in some sense, touched by her influence. In 1941, in January, he gives the 4 Freedoms speech. The 4 freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. They become part of the Atlanta Charter in August 1941 with Winston Churchill, where the pact between the United States and England is formed before we're in the war. We don't get in the war until Pearl Harbor in December. That Atlantic Charter and the 4 Freedoms become the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is Eleanor's great accomplishment. She regards it, as you suggested, Chris, as the most significant thing she did in the public realm. And that declaration, which became critical to the formation of the United Nations, is now the reference for evaluating a government in terms of its fidelity to human rights. And where it is not living up to that declaration, it is a point of criticism, international criticism, by an organ of the United Nations that is evaluating how human rights are being dealt with. So she emerged in her own right after his death. She had 18 years of a career on her own where she became known as the first lady of the world, and of just enormous consequence. I heard her speak in Beverly Hills High School, and the place was packed. The place I subsequently became president of Wilkes College. I learned this story from some alumni. They had formed a World Federalist Society and a Model United Nations chapter. And someone said, who can we get as a speaker? Someone said, why don't we try to get Mrs. Roosevelt? People said, you'll never get Mrs. Roosevelt. And the president of the club said, let me go. He found her number, went to a payphone, called her up, and she said, I'll have to check my calendar. Called back, and she could come. So she came to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and she made a major lecture to the town. But she then met with the students in a room afterwards. They sat on the floor around her and talked with her. I could tell you that 20 of those stories I've learned from different people who were part of a group that Mrs. Roosevelt came to see, often young people, because she really knew that young people were the future, and she wanted to touch the future. So that's I think she herself acknowledged, and she wrote, I think, 17 books, something like that. She was not a very successful mother, but she was a great grandmother. And her grandchildren, who called her grand-mère, the French, were devoted to her, and she devoted to them. She had trouble with almost all of her children, who suffered as many of the children of particularly great men, suffer, as the children of Winston Churchill suffered. But their children, the grandchildren of the great people, many of them turn out to be just fantastic people. And you know Anne Roosevelt as one of them, and Chris Roosevelt you've met. You've met James Roosevelt, who's the brother of Anne Roosevelt. So she, as basically an orphan, produced 5 children. And when I was working in Hyde Park, there were 29 grandchildren. There have been 19 marriages among the 5 children. So monogamous marriage, or only one marriage per person, was not the characteristic of the Roosevelt children. But they got the genes, and they got the social justice philosophy of both their grandparents. And they're a great group of people.
I mean, in listening to you say that, I was just thinking, as you mentioned, I've had the great good fortune of meeting a number of members of the family, again, for your kindness. But most especially Anne, with whom I've had several more extended interactions. And every time I'm in her presence, she just makes you feel like you're the only person in the room, and that you're all that matters. And every time I've interacted with her, she's just been fantastic. And as you know, as I was listening to you speak about Eleanor and her interactions with young people, I was thinking to myself, yeah, I see where the granddaughter Anne gets it from. And it's funny because every time I speak to Anne, even now, we don't, it's not like we run into each other, excuse me, regularly, but I still see her occasionally at events, and I'll make a point of saying hello. But every time I talk to her, I feel like I'm talking to Eleanor Roosevelt in that way.
You can summon a glass of water.
Yeah.
I will say a little bit about Frances Perkins.
Mm-hmm.
She was, in many ways, she was the intellectual architect of the New Deal. And she had developed her perspective on the role of government in helping working people, unemployed, the elderly, the disabled. In the course of her work as a social worker, and the big event that transformed her life was the Triangle Fire in March 1911, in which 146, primarily young women, but some young men, were burned to death or jumped to their death from the 10th story of the Triangle Fire building right off Washington Square in New York City. She witnessed it. So she saw girls flying through the air on fire. And she already was working for the National Consumers League. And one of her jobs was focusing on fire safety requirements. And she had just been working on a fire in Newark, also a textile fire, by the way, where a much lower building, but still people jumped to their death to escape the fire. So she was very attuned to those issues when the Triangle Fire happened, which was the greatest disaster in New York until 9/11. And it had a incredible impact on labor unions, particularly women labor unions, the International Lady Workers Union, but also the social reform movement. And she was, at this point, a social worker who'd come through working with Jane Addams at Hull House in Chicago, the settlement house movement. She'd worked in a program in Philadelphia where she worked with immigrant women and Black women from the South who had become prostitutes. And she tried to break that system and particularly deal with the women's needs. And then she came to New York and went to Columbia University, did a master's degree in politics and economics, and then began working for the Consumers League as their lead person in New York City. Well, after the Triangle Fire, that led to a commission studying what should be done from what they learned from the fire. We're going to have a commission like that, I'm sure, after this pandemic, which we asked the question, what did we do? What should we have done? How should we have known that this was a threat? All the same kind of questions were asked by the Factory Investigating Commission. And she was the lead investigator, and she was recommended for that by Theodore Roosevelt. So she links the progressive bull moose movement of Theodore Roosevelt in his post-presidential years through Al Smith to Franklin Roosevelt as president. She is the continuity intellectually through that whole period. And she starts looking at not just what do we have to help that mother of 5 kids who's got an alcoholic husband who's unemployed, but how do we deal with the systems? What are the systems that need doing? And you deal with the systems through public policy, through government. So she started doing that for Al Smith. She became part of the industrial commission that was created by among the 39 bills that came out of the Factory Investigating Commission, which met for 3 years, by the way. And so she was on the commission created by that. And she became, in 1925, the lead of that commission. So it was the first job of a senior sort at the administrative level, at a state level, for a woman in American history. And she went on from there to be the industrial commissioner for Roosevelt as governor for 4 years. And Eleanor was the one that pushed him to appoint her. And she's then one that pushed him to appoint her as Secretary of Labor when he became president. And when he wanted her to accept, she had reasons not to want this job because she had a husband who had bipolar, manic depression, before we had drugs that helped people with that. So he was periodically in and out of sanitaria, had alcohol problems, and she had a daughter who was bipolar, and it was a source of constant worry. So for her to leave New York to go to Washington, she felt it had to be worth her while in terms of what she could accomplish. So when Roosevelt asked her to come to the Roosevelt House in New York, which is where he and Eleanor had a townhouse, which was cheek by jowl with one built for his mother, with doors on every floor that connected to the 2 houses so that she could be part of their lives, which is a little claustrophobic for Eleanor. Frances had a list, and she told me this herself. I shouldn't call her Frances. She was Miss Perkins, just as Mrs. Roosevelt was, to that era, was Mrs. Roosevelt. You would never have called her Eleanor. She had a list she put on the back of an envelope, And these were the things that she wanted Roosevelt's support on if she were to accept the position of Secretary of Labor. And they included unemployment insurance, workman's comp, limited hours for women working, abolition of child labor, 40-hour work week, minimum wage, Social Security, and a national health system. Well, he said she would have to fight for these things on her own, but he would support her. And they got everything except national health, which was in the original Social Security Bill of 1935, but the doctors were so opposed to it as socialized medicine that it got dropped out, and is still, as you know, is a issue we're struggling with today. But she stayed all 12 years. She was one of only 2 cabinet members that served the entire time that Roosevelt was president. And arguably, the book that by Kirsten Downey that has really brought her back in public focus is called The Woman Behind the New Deal. And it shows that from that meeting at the Roosevelt home in Manhattan came an agenda which we really call the New Deal agenda. And I had the chance of living in the same house with her, often after dinner going up and sitting like you and I are talking now, and pummeling her with questions. And I would sometimes go back to my room and write down what I'd remembered from our conversation. And by the way, that is an essay that you can find Googling me. It's called The Frances Perkins I Knew. I wrote it the year after she died. So it's my recollection. I've not changed a word in it. There's some things that I would like to, but I decided I should leave it as is. Frances Perkins I Knew by Christopher Breiseth, and you get that on Google or at the francesperkinscenter.org.
And having read it, I can tell you it's a fantastic piece and just a really compelling window into both your relationship with her and into her as a person. Before we wrap things up here, I wanted to ask you in closing, as you look back at the arc of both your life and career, what do you think the 2 or 3 most important things you've learned are in terms of either life lessons or career advice that you might want to impart to the young people who are the target audience for this conversation?
Well, since I was a college president for 20 years, 17 at Wilkes, I had occasion to give a lot of speeches. And one of the things I said in every speech is if you're fortunate enough to have children, the most important thing you'll do with your life is how you raise your children. I don't care what big position you may take. If you don't do a good job of that, you've got a failure in your life that's very important. And as a father of 3 daughters who make both my late wife and me very proud of what they're doing to help others, and all 3 of them are doing that actively with their careers and raising children, I put that as number 1. Number 2, I think it's akin to that. It's been all the things I've done along the way that have invested in young people. As a teacher, as a college president, and at Deep Springs, the students actually owned the college, so I worked for them, which was not always an easy thing, to work with 18 and 19-year-olds who feel a sense of ownership and who are very, very bright, as Bill Van Hoovel was and is. So measuring what I've done or I'm doing at almost any time by my interaction with young people and what possible positive impact I'm having on them is right up there, the second order of priority. And I think the third is following my love of history and being serious about what we can learn from the past. And because I'm interested in political history, I'm very attuned to the issue of leadership and what it is that leadership can provide. And I go to the story I tell when I have a chance to talk to middle school students or elementary students for career day. And it kind of brings me back to what I started on. One of the things during the war, they used child labor, speaking of child labor, to replace adult labor. And in Minneapolis, all of the schools appointed somebody any given term to be the school messenger. And I was the messenger for Margaret Fuller School, which meant that once a week, I was given 2 tokens and 10 cents. I would then a canvas bag that had all the films, 16 millimeter films that were being shown, and inter office mail between the school and the school board office. I would once a week go down on the streetcar to downtown Minneapolis, and this is now in 5th, maybe 6th grade. I can't quite pinpoint it. Probably 6th grade. And I would get down there and I would then give up those films. I'd get more films that the teachers had ordered, and I'd get the payroll and other intercampus mail, and I would bring that back. Where we messengers sat, of course, we got to know each other, which was a great sense of getting to know kids like yourself, but we're not part of your own school, to realize there's a bigger world out there to just explore. We sat outside the superintendent's office. And the superintendent, who was a man named Willard Goslin, was a wonderful, wonderful man, was in the process of dealing with a potential school strike, first strike in American history. And it was being pushed by veterans who'd come back from World War II and were teachers and were making wages that they could not support a family with. So I sat outside and I watched Superintendent Goslin with one group of people after another coming in on my different weeks that I was there. And I realized the weight that was on his shoulders of an entire public school system, in which I was a little part. But I remember saying to myself, I want to be a leader like that. And of course, as I said earlier, what I really wanted to do was president of the United States. But you know, the point is that virtually every place I've been, I've played a leadership role. And if I wanted to say, where were the roots of that? They came from being a school messenger in 6th grade during the war, right after the war. This actually was right after the war. But we still were playing these roles that had been developed during the war.
I wonder if, before I ask you if you have any final thoughts, another question occurred to me in the context of your response, which is, it strikes me, as you know, I work with middle and high school age students myself as a mentor. And one of the things that I have been saying to some of them is that they really should be keeping a journal and writing in it on a daily or nearly daily basis about the experience of what it's like for them living under the realities that have been imposed upon us by COVID-19, both for their own recollection, but also because they have a chance to make some of their own history, and some of that may well become primary source material after my generation is long gone, and even after their generation is long gone. To the extent that you want to and feel comfortable, what advice would you have to a young person seeking to sort of catalog, if you will, memorialize in writing their experiences of the pandemic, whether they're doing it either for personal reflection or perhaps with an eye toward being a resource for scholars of the future?
First of all, I don't think you can separate clear thinking from writing. I think you clarify your thinking by writing your ideas, by shaping them, by writing paragraphs, and writing essays. And your journal is a prime source of that, where you literally are thinking about the day or an experience you've gone through or a trauma that you've had, and committing it to writing is to clarify what you think about it, which I think is not only good for the future historians that are going to read your journal when you're famous, but also people who want to read about what people of your generation were thinking when they went through a big situation like this present pandemic. I kept journals off and on. I really stopped, except for a very almost expanded calendar, which I did while I was a college president, so that I would recall the events of the day rather than a discursive essay. But when I was in junior high school and high school, I kept one that was an essay form. I'm writing my memoir now, and it is invaluable for me to go back and capture what I was thinking in high school, and then what I said about it at the time. And it's kind of stunning to go back and realize how many thoughts I have now I had then, and how much I processed my friendships with people, the way I understand those friendships, my present friendships. So there's a continuity to who you are as a person that you'll encounter by having that journal. It'll also, of course, refresh your mind of situations, of people you'd forgotten or whose names you've forgotten, friendships that were very important that had faded in memory, all of a sudden become vivid again. So it's got all kinds of rewards, but at the very beginning, it helps you to think clearly. And one of my problems that I fear about with this use of technology is that we're committing so much to our cell phones and to the memory on those cell phones that we probably never will retrieve, and that we are into casual communication that doesn't force us to be clear about language and take language as seriously as I think clear thinking requires us to take it. So the writing itself is a virtue in this regard, although there's also value in doing a tape recording or recording into your iPhone at the end of the day for things that you want to remember, and putting it on a flash drive where you keep your diary that way. Not again that, but I think unless you edit that and polish the language, it will not have the value of a written diary that literally has you working with language and your own thoughts as a kind of married process between two parts of who you are.
As we bring the conversation to a close today, is there anything else that you would like to say in closing, or other thoughts you'd like to share before we conclude here?
I think for all of us who've dealt with language in a serious way, there are certain words that are very powerful to us. And one word is politics. And it's used in the negative by so many people. And as someone who has dealt almost at first hand with the traditions of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, there is no higher calling in our society than being a politician, and to be the political leader of our country, or the political leader of a state, or the political leader of a city or a county, or of a school board. We ultimately sort out our most important values through politics. And while it's often a messy situation, it's often corrupt, the process itself is crucial to our democracy. And if you don't have the democracy, you're likely to have an authoritarian regime run by a dictator, which is always a risk, even for America. So I would say that if a spark in you is interested in politics, let it risk being burst into a flame. And you won't be a politician unless the flame is ignited, because it requires a lot of ego, it requires a lot of discipline, a lot of sacrifice for you and your family. But without political leadership, our society can't survive as a democracy. So politics, a beautiful word.
I think that's a perfect note on which to wrap our conversation up. Listen, as I said toward the beginning, we've known each other for 15, 16, 17 odd years. I can't thank you enough for this. This has been, initially, I had a feeling that this conversation would be fantastic and enlightening, and it was everything that I thought it would be and more. And I certainly hope that you, Chris, enjoyed it as well. And I hope that our viewing audience got a lot out of it. If you're watching this at the time that COVID-19 is an ever-present reality, I would just like to leave you with the thought that we will get through this as a nation, and we will survive, and our relationships will thrive again, and we will see each other again and have those human interactions again. As Dr. Breiseth said, I don't think things will be quite the same, but perhaps that will even be for the better in some really important and significant ways.
In fact, the obligation is on all of us to make sure that what replaces this is even better. And that is on our shoulders as much as it is on anybody else's.
Well, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a great day. And again, if you're watching this in these difficult times, hang in there. It will get better. Thank you.